The 6th Legion, the Space Wolves. Primarch, Leman Russ. Allegiance, Loyalist. Homeworld, Fenris. Current Commander, Logan Grimnar. Specialization, Shock Assault Combat. Battle Cry, For Russ and the Allfather. During the Unification Wars, the 6th Legion was one of the few not deployed to assist in the reclamation of Earth. Drawn from various barbaric and savage tribes of Terra, the 6th had been given highly unique and specialized gene seed for reasons only known to the Emperor. It wouldn't be until a few decades into the Great Crusade that the Emperor would unleash the 6th for the first time. Very quickly, the 6th established themselves as a small but very capable battle group. They were vicious in the assault, garnering a reputation for ferocity and destructive battle tactics. Though smaller than most legions, they were able to hold their own alongside the others. It became so common for the 6th to spark terror in the hearts of their enemies, they earned the nickname the Routers. However, while the 6th did garner a reputation for ferocity, they also were known to be undisciplined in the extreme. Not only were they unnecessarily cruel in many cases, but they had a tendency to give in to tendencies of extreme aggression, massacring thousands of innocent civilians, especially during what was intended to be a surgical put-down to a planetary revolt on Molarian. Their lack of discipline is what led to the implementation of a consul obsequiarii within the ranks of the legions, though the 6th would have the largest in order to keep them in check. The consul was a sort of early form of chaplain who was in charge of maintaining the discipline of the legion and preventing each wanton destruction again. If a brother stepped out of line, the consul had the right to execute them. In this way, the Emperor had properly leashed his beasts. But it would not take long for the Emperor to find the perfect alpha beast to truly rein in his 6th Legion. The Primarch, to be known as Leman Russ, was left on the planet Fenris, where he was found as a child by a Fenrisian she-wolf who raised him with the pack. However, when the humans of Fenris had a series of conflicts with this pack, they discovered Russ and were unsure of what to make of this feral boy. He was eventually captured, bound, and brought to the king, and here the king saw the potential in the Primarch and took him under his wing to raise him in the ways of Fenris. Through this, Leman began to learn that he was more human than wolf, and he learned to speak, to dance, to laugh, to sing, and to fight. When the king died, there was no question who would take the throne next. Leman became known as the Wolf King. Not long into his rulership, he would be visited by the Emperor, who revealed he was the master of mankind. Unwilling to accept this man as his gene father, Leman Russ challenged the Emperor to a series of tests. In competitions of both eating and drinking, Russ was always the victor. However, in a competition of strength and combat, Russ was soundly defeated. The Emperor, having seen the strength of Russ, accepted him as his Primarch son and gave him his legion to command. With Russ at their head at last, the 6th Legion would rename themselves the Space Wolves, or the Vilka Fenrica in their native tongue. The first major engagement the Space Wolves would engage in was known as the Wheel of Fire campaign. This campaign would not be the roaring victory everyone expected by the Imperium. Russ would lose a third of his whole legion, and the vast majority of his Terran-born sons along with them. But this would create two very critical effects for the legion. First, with the majority of the Terran-born wolves dead, that meant the legion was almost entirely Fenrisian from here on, further cementing Fenris as the homeworld of the Space Wolves and creating a faster and even more efficient sense of unity and conformity in the legion as a whole. But second, it also began a sense of tribal isolation from the other legions. The Fang, which would be the great citadel built for the Space Wolves on Fenris, would be housed with all the necessary gene working and conditioning facilities necessary to maintain their presence and connection to Fenris, without requiring the outside aid of the larger Imperium to the extent of other legions. This meant that many other legions developed differing viewpoints on the wolves. However, their reputation would change drastically through the Great Crusade from noble savages into the true wolves of the Emperor. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves would earn renown, respect, and awe from the Imperium for their many great victories and accomplishments, including the discovery of a new STP for a kind of tank, which the Mechanicus named Lemun Russ in honor of the wolves. Known for their encirclement tactics and ferocious capabilities in war, the Space Wolves proved themselves to be unwavering and uniquely deadly, even among Astartes. However, there were problems as well. The Space Wolves were dubbed the Emperor's Executioners, which was both a praise as well as a criticism. The Space Wolves were infamous for genocide and brutal cleansing of worlds, as well as engaging in numerous bloody clashes with other legions, such as the World Eaters, the Thousand Sons, and the Dark Angels. It has been believed by many that the Emperor intended the Space Wolves to be his go-to legion if other legions turned traitor, as it was speculated the Space Wolves played a role in the extermination of the 2nd and 11th Lost Legions. Perhaps this is why they rarely interacted well with their cousins from other legions. Indeed, the Space Wolves have been called upon by the Emperor to engage in battles and campaigns the likes of which only known to a few. Like the Dark Angels, there have been some engagements the Space Wolves have fought that are not recorded, as the battles are against cosmic horrors the Imperium was never meant to know existed. But it would be the threats closer to home that would truly put the Wolves to the test. When Horus and the other traitor primarchs began their rebellion, there were always the questions of which primarchs would stay loyal. Some were questionable, such as Jagatai Khan, Magnus the Red, or Lorgar. However, there was no doubt as to the loyalties of Leman Russ or the Space Wolves, and for this reason, Malkador the Sigillite ordered the Space Wolves to send small wolf packs to tail and spy on all the primarchs, and in the event that their loyalties falter, the wolf packs would be tasked with killing the primarch by whatever means necessary. While some, like the Ultramarines and Salamanders, were accepting of their new shadows with bitter resignation, others, like the Alpha Legion and the Night Lords, had their Wolfpack spies killed, sending a clear message as to their intended loyalties. When it was believed Magnus the Red had violated the Council of Nicaea, Russ and the Space Wolves were sent to arrest him and bring him to Terra. Horus, who had already begun his treachery by this point, tried to deceive Russ and tell him that the Emperor had changed his mind and demand Russ kill Magnus. Russ was skeptical, but didn't want to disobey the Emperor, so he launched a full and all-out invasion of Magnus's planet of Prospero, where the Thousand Sons fought the Space Wolves in a vicious and bloody siege. In the end, the traitors managed to escape to the Eye of Terror, and Prospero was all but razed to the ground. The 13th Great Company of the Space Wolves actually chased down the running away Thousand Sons into the Eye of Terror and were never heard from again. Upon leaving Prospero, the Wolves were attacked by the Alpha Legion in space and were forced to retreat until saved by a force of the Dark Angels. With the support of the Angels, Russ and the majority of his legion were able to reach Terra and organize a counter-offensive to try and kill Horus. This would lead Russ and the Wolves to encountering and battling the sons of Horus and the War Master himself at the Battle of Trisolian. There, Russ and the Wolves would make a good account of themselves, and Russ was even able to wound Horus Lupercal. But a wound was all he could offer. Russ was beaten back and knocked unconscious by Horus, and the Wolves without their leader were left overwhelmed, confused, and on the back foot. They would retreat again, pursued by traitors, until relief would come in the form of Corvus Corax and his Raven Guard Legion. Russ would awaken to greet Corax, but would then fall back into his coma again shortly after, the threat still very much undealt with. When Russ finally did awaken, it would not be a moment too soon, as he and his legion would link up with Lionel Johnson and the Dark Angels, who were in the process of destroying the traitor homeworlds in an attempt to draw attention away from Terra and lure the traitors to them. To this end, the Space Wolves aided the Dark Angels in the destruction of Barbarous, the homeworld of the Death Guard Legion. After this, Lion and Russ would both rush to Terra to aid the Imperium, but too late to save the Emperor. It would be a new age for the Imperium, and for the Space Wolves Legion. Leman Russ was devastated by his inability to be present to aid the Emperor. The loss had an effect on him. He was no longer as brash or as wild as he once seemed. His outlook seemed to have softened somewhat. For example, in the Dulan campaign during the Crusade, he had lost his temper when Lionel Johnson had killed the planetary governor before he could have the honor, and he'd attacked Lion out of anger. But now, when Lion came to him in a grief-stricken rage, demanding they finish their duel so he could punish Russ, and by extension himself, for not being there to rescue the Emperor, Russ refused, and even allowed Lion to stab him with his sword without retaliation. This act, though seemingly brutal, allowed the two brothers to finally put aside their grudges and come to respectable terms. Though the High Lords of Terra and Guilliman elected not to pursue the traitors after the heresy, Russ was eager to punish the enemies of man and led an attack on the traitor-controlled world of Mars to relieve the Mechanicum. Eventually, Russ would lead an attack into the Eye of Terror itself to seek out the traitors. However, Russ would vanish, claiming before his departure that he would return in the final battle of the Wolf Time. The Space Wolves, crippled and saddened by this loss, began a series of great hunts to seek out and find their primarch. The Legion would divide itself into small roving parties and scour the stars in search of their leader. And wherever they went, they brought the force, strength, and will of their Legion, bringing great victories for mankind where they traveled, but never able to truly find their primarch. With Russ gone, the Space Wolves were left to decide their direction going forward. This was made more challenging with the implementation of the Codex Astartes by Guilliman. This book was meant to curtail independence and bring uniformity to the legions so as to prevent a future heresy. The Space Wolves were starkly opposed to the Codex, choosing a path of nonconformity and anti-authoritarian behavior, choosing to act and perform as they saw fit. The only aspect of the Codex they did agree with was the implementation of chapters. Guilliman believed that the legions were too dangerous as large as they were, so it was required that all legions break down their strength into chapters of only 1,000 Marines apiece with their own chapter masters. The Wolves, smaller than most other legions, attempted to comply with this by forming a successor chapter called the Wolf Brothers. But this chapter would prove unviable and was disbanded by the Inquisition due to rampant gene seed mutation. It was discovered that the gene seed of the Space Wolves was mutated and near impossible to make chapters out of, and it would be further complicated by the fact that the gene seed suffered yet another mutation in which only Fenrisian-born sons could be made into Space Wolves, preventing the Space Wolves from recruiting off-world. As a result, the Space Wolves would be the only Loyalist Legion not to establish any successor chapters until the Ultima founding in M42. Beyond just their chapter's unstable gene seed, the Space Wolves would develop an isolationist culture of tribal and primal traditions. They developed a fierce hatred of psychers, warp sorcery, and mutations into their chapters, particularly in chapters like the Flesh Tearers, who they have had more than a few clashes with. But more impressively than this, the Space Wolves have gone to war with the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, and the Grey Knights in various different situations. In 445 M41, in what was known as the Months of Shame, the Space Wolves went to war with the Inquisition and the Grey Knights over their disapproval of the genocide of innocents on the planet Armageddon after the war to protect it. The Wolves successfully defended their planet, killed the Grand Master of the Grey Knights, and suffered no censure or punishment. In 886 M41, the Ecclesiarchy arrived at Fenris to investigate their worship of pagan gods, something clearly outlawed in the Imperial Creed. The Space Wolves fired on the Ecclesiarchy and chased them off. When they returned months later with 3 orders of the Sisters of Battle and attempted to land on Fenris by force, the Space Wolves fought back and forced them to withdraw for good after 3 weeks of fighting. No further censure or punishment was issued for this. And in the final year of M41, the Space Wolves would nearly be overwhelmed by an invasion of both Chaos and Dark Angels in their system. Eventually, the Space Wolves would form a truce and understanding with the Dark Angels and push back Chaos from their system, although there would be extreme damage left after the siege that the Space Wolves are still recovering from. And at last, with the return of Guilliman, Guilliman has attempted to introduce the Primaris to the Space Wolves. At first, the Wolves were distrustful and unwilling to accept these new Marines. However, in time, Logan Grimnar would deem the Primaris as worthy, even hoping that other presence might finally allow them to create successor chapters of the Wolves. The modern Space Wolves now continue to serve the Imperium in their own unique way, not at the behest of the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, or Guilliman, but by the waves of their own traditions. Unlike the majority of other chapters, the Space Wolves do not have 10 standard companies, but rather 12 massive great companies. The size and strength of each varies, but each is an army unto itself, with individual customs, traditions, beliefs, fleets, and forges, so that each one is capable of acting independently of the rest. Each great company is commanded by a Wolf Lord, with only the first company, the Champions of Fenris, being commanded by the Great Wolf himself, Logan Grimnar. The 12 companies are the Champions of Fenris, the Bloodmaws, the Sea Wolves, the Sons of Morkai, the Red Moons, the Death Wolves, the Storm Wolves, the Dusk Wolves, the Drake Slayers, the Black Manes, the Rune Marked, and the Grimbloods. Each great company divides up its Marines into smaller packs, which function like squads. The size of a pack varies depending on their level and ability. All packs start with around 15 to 20 Marines and are called Bloodclaw packs. As time goes on, these packs will engage in battle after battle, suffering losses along the way. However, unlike other chapters who would bring reinforcements to help bolster these packs, the Space Wolves tend not to give reinforcements, but rather increase their rank based on their battle losses and experiences. This is done largely to weed out weaker brothers and ensure that the more reckless and wild do not weaken the chapter further. There are instances of a pack being whittled down to just one Marine who will be called a lone wolf. Among the leadership of the Space Wolves are their priests. The Wolf Priests act as both chaplains and apothecaries, choosing aspirants for initiation into the Space Wolves and ensuring that the traditions of the chapter are maintained. They do not use traditional and codex compliant medical equipment, but rather balms, potions, and techniques of their homeworld. The Rune Priests are the chapter's version of librarians. They use formidable psyker-like powers, but maintain that they do not draw their power from the warp like other sanctioned psykers, but instead draw them from the shamanistic principles and practices of their homeworld Fenris. The Iron Priests are the Wolves' equivalent of Tech Marines. They maintain the machines and equipment of the company and will also choose new Iron Priests personally from smiths on Fenris. Induction into the Space Wolves is a very unique and sacred series of rituals. Priests wander among the tribes of Fenris searching for worthy champions and contenders, and then will take them to the Fang, their fortress monastery, to begin basic training. Once the proper training is complete, they will be tested by passing through the Gate of Mordecai, where they will be exposed to the touch of chaos. If the aspirant endures and is not corrupted, he is allowed to take the final test, the test of Mordecai. He is made to drink from the cup of the Wolven and take on the Canis Helix. He is then deposited into the wilds of Fenris with minimal clothing and equipment and told to return to the Fang on their own. If they survive and return, they are accepted as Space Wolves. Some notable Space Wolves include Logan Grimnar, the current Great Wolf and Chapter Master of the Space Wolves. His battle honors are extensive and his capabilities nigh incomparable. He's bested Magnus the Red in combat, wields a Chaos Forged weapon without negative repercussions, has killed the Grand Master of the Grey Knights, and is considered by some to be the greatest Chapter Master currently active in the Imperium of Man. Rather than feared, he's actually greatly respected by many common folk in the Imperium, as he has a compassion for the weak and outspokenly opposed to the Inquisition and Ecclesiarchy on numerous occasions. Then there's Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a dreadnought of the Space Wolves who once walked and served alongside Leman Russ himself, making him the oldest living space marine in the galaxy. He holds a very staunch and traditionalist view of the Imperium, and many wolves approach him for counsel and advice. He is a tie to the wolves' ancient past and their origins. And Ragnar Blackmane. Ragnar is considered one of the most powerful Space Wolves in his generation and a truly commendable Wolf Lord, having redeemed the honor of the Space Wolves on numerous occasions, stopping a Chaos Sorcerer from destroying the Wolves entirely, and being one of the only non-Dark Angels to know the secret of the Fallen and be allowed to live knowing it. The Space Wolves have many strengths. They are ferocious combatants, easily on par with the strongest Space Marine chapters in the Imperium. They are well-rounded in both close quarters melee and support fire teams. They possess excellent maneuverability and flexibility in the assault, and are no strangers to defensive tactics either, making them very well-rounded. Further, their aggression and battle ferocity make them incredibly hard to manage in short form or initial skirmishes, giving the Space Wolves a lot of early battle advantage. Further, because the Space Wolves operate outside the scope of the Codex Astartes and do not answer to the other Imperium authority figures, they have long been an independent operated and managed chapter, and as a result of this, their individual companies are all strong on their own merits rather than relying on the overall strength of their chapter, meaning a single great company by itself is a mighty force to be reckoned with, and it also means that they are not curtailed or restrained by outside powers or expectations. They answer to no one but themselves, and this makes them tenacious, zealous, and committed in their actions. That said, the Space Wolves have a smaller chapter than most other legions due to various factors, including the instability of their gene seed, causing many young aspirants to fall to the curse of the Wolven, the fact they only recruit from their homeworld, as well as their deep-seated need to maintain tradition and customs, and as a result, the Legion always runs the risk of full destruction should Fenris be targeted or the Wolves get cornered, which has happened on more than one occasion, but the Space Wolves always manage to overcome the challenges presented. But the biggest and most glaring weakness of the Space Wolves is the Curse of the Wolven, a mutation in the gene seed of the Space Wolves which causes Space Wolves to struggle against a primal internal beast. Should they succumb to the curse, the Marine will transform into a large feral wolf-like beast, not unlike a werewolf, and lose all humanity they have. Many aspirants of the Space Wolves fall to this curse and are lost to the wilds of Fenris, and there are cases of a Marine suddenly transforming in the heat of battle. However, the Wolven are not quite as damning as one might be led to believe. For one thing, there are cases of tamed Wolven squads. Wolven Marines who are sent into battle and are manageable, as well as Wolven dreadnoughts, who will be unleashed upon enemy strongholds and allowed to lay waste to enemy positions. They also aren't a very well guarded secret, as they've been seen by external elements before, and there have been very few instances of censure or inquiry about them. The biggest drawback to the Wolven is simply that the fact that the curse presence can lead to aspirants or Marines transforming and being uncontrollable or being lost to the wilds and thus needing to be put down. Alright, my personal opinion is I detest the Space Wolves. My dislike for them is probably greater than any other legion purely because of how insufferably perfect they are. Say what you will about the Ultramarines, they're Boy Scout Marines, make no mistake, but they own that title and can be accused of little more than being boring. But the Wolves infuriate me because everything about their existence breaks the internal rules of 40k, and yet no one seems to bat an eye at it. Let's go down the list. They can only recruit from their homeworld of Fenris because Fenris is just so super special awesome that only born sons of Fenris can be Space Wolves, and this has mutated their gene seed to reflect it. Never mind how that kind of mutation makes no sense for a gene seed, but it's okay, accept it. Second, they are able to recruit young men rather than be limited to just children. According to the lore that I found, wolf priests travel among the tribes looking at worthy champions of fighting competitions to recruit, and iron priests will recruit well-known or skilled artisans and smiths who travel to find them and earn their respect. So we're not just talking about children as would normally be the case, but at the very youngest, teens, at the oldest, young men. So, okay, there's that too. Number 3, the wolf priests or rune priests don't use the warp when performing their supernatural feats, but rather the unique energies of Fenris, meaning they have the right to hate other psychers and warp users, but they're perfectly valid as an exception somehow. Then there's Ragnar Blackmane. He learns the secrets of the Fallen, and the Dark Angels just allow this. No, really, in the book Wolfblade, Ragnar works alongside the Dark Angels to capture a Fallen, where he learns their secret, but he just lives on. He doesn't get attacked for it. He doesn't get punished for it. He doesn't get arrested. Never mind how the Dark Angels were prepared to attack a literal primarch to guard this secret. But a Space Wolf, one of their ancestral rivals, that's fine. He can know about it. Then there's the Wolven. The Space Wolves suffered the gene mutation of the Wolven, but not only is this defect hardly a guarded secret, only recent new lore tries to make it seem like a problem with the Curse of the Wolven. Remember me mentioning some time ago the 13th Company of the Space Wolves who went missing after the Siege of Prospero? Well, apparently the Curse of the Wolven is most prominent in this company. Even though they went missing 10,000 years ago, they are just now returning to the galaxy, and the Space Wolves are trying desperately to round them up and bring them back to Fenris before they're discovered by the Inquisition. So, an ancient portion of your chapter from the Heresy and Great Crusade days is now suddenly returning to the modern era, and your chapter's working hard to find them and hide them so that there's no problems. Does that sound like another chapter we know of? Does that sound at all familiar? Gee, that rivalry between Space Wolves and Dark Angels really must not be that close if the Wolves have to rip off lore from the Dark Angels just to seem grimdark, and it's not even that grimdark. At least with the Fallen and the Dark Angels are ashamed of what the Fallen are and are trying to capture them, interrogate them, and kill them to hide their shame. The Wolven of the 13th Company are all loyalists, spent all their time in the Eye of Terror, totally fine, not turning to chaos, are all basically werewolves that can control themselves. And it's not that they're trying to put them down or destroy them. The Space Wolves just want to save them and bring them back to their planet. It's hardly that grimdark. But moving on from that, let's go into Logan Grimnar. Logan Grimnar's main weapon is an axe forged by the Chaos God Khorne that he got off of a Chaos Demon. First of all, ignore the reality that most Space Marines would not allow you to take a weapon like that. There was actually books during the Horus Heresy novels where they revealed there were rules about not taking weapons off of Xenos, let alone demons. And never mind the fact that the Space Wolves have a hatred for all things Psyker, warp-related, or demonic. But no, he keeps this axe of Khorne, has it repurposed and covered in runes so that now it's the axe of Mordecai, and so it can no longer corrupt him. Again, never mind the fact that even a primarch, Fulgrim, was corrupted by a chaos weapon. He's fine. He's not corrupted by it. He made it rework for him. Fine. Okay. I guess that's okay, except for the fact it still has all the powers necessary to damage Magnus the Red during their duel, which Khorne found really funny. Oh, did I forget to mention that? Yes, Logan Grimnar battled and beat Magnus the Red, a primarch, in single combat. Now granted, banishing him required the help of some Grey Knights, so it wasn't entirely by himself, but the fact that he could go toe-to-toe with Magnus the Red and land blows with a chaos-made axe that does not affect him negatively but still works for all intended purposes is outstanding. That's not even counting on the fact that he single-handedly killed the Grand Master of the Grey Knights during the Months of Shame. Let's just ignore all that. Logan Grimnar is just that awesome, apparently. Speaking of which, the Space Wolves went to war with the Inquisition and the Grey Knights, who were all invading Fenris. Not only did they win, and Logan Grimnar decapitating the Grey Knights' Grand Master in a single blow, no censure. No further punishments, they just backed off. This one's minor, but the Space Wolves, despite being Astartes and being incapable of being poisoned or intoxicated, they developed a mead that can get them drunk, meaning they can actually break the boundaries of their own genetic engineering. You heard that right. Even though Space Marines cannot get drunk, in order to keep the Viking aesthetic, the Space Wolves developed a mead that can break the boundaries of their genetic engineering and get them drunk. Let that sink in. And then the last note I have here, the Space Wolves were allowed during the Heresy, I learned this recently, to form kill teams stationed near every Primarch with orders to kill that Primarch if they showed any signs of heresy. Never mind that the Space Wolves were still one of the smaller legions and probably couldn't afford to send all these packs like this to every Primarch, but what made them think they actually were capable of taking down a Primarch if they turned traitor? In fact, one wolf pack was able to anticipate, engage, and stall Conrad Kurz on McCragg, who was considered one of the most infamously unpredictable, ruthless, and stealthy Primarchs, all in order to protect Guilliman's mother in the Imperium Secundus era. All of that is a list of stuff off the top of my head that reveals why the Space Wolves annoy the tar out of me. And yet, what bothers me more than any of this is whenever I talk about this with their fan base, the fan base will still sing their praises like howling dogs and piss on any form of criticism as just hating. I made a whole video talking about how I'd like to fix a Space Wolf with some lore additions and was called a hater for it. These people are perfectly fine with their Gary Stu corgis as long as Games Workshop keeps tossing them bones. Their faults don't matter, but only serve to highlight their awesomeness. Their weaknesses are non-existent. Their exploits defy the capabilities of any other legions. Their internal lore and structure defies logical expectations. They actually have no grimdark aspect to them that isn't explained away to make them look even cooler, and yet the fanbase will claim that all this makes the Space Wolves cool. Yes, because breaking from the internal consistency and rules of your own universe is cool. Screw the Space Wolves. If Leman Russ does come back, I hope the first thing he does is force their noses in their own shit tier lore. Yeah, I really don't like the Space Wolves, and all the research I had to do to make this video only made me dislike them more. If you like the Space Wolves, that's fine, okay? I never judge a person by the things that they enjoy. If you're a fan of the Space Wolves, glad you like them, glad you found something there that I didn't. But based on my own reading of the Space Wolves, based on the research I've done into them and what I've learned, there's nothing redeeming about them. I find them incredibly annoying, not even boring, just incredibly annoying, in the Gary Stu corgis. Hopefully the next Legion will be a little bit more interesting. Wait, next is the 7th. Oh boy. Anyway, that's all for this video. See you in the next one, guys.